His positions in the Israeli Ministry of Defense and the IDF has carried out intelligence analysis and strategic policy planning. In this latter capacity, he served as Assistant Secretary of the committee charged with formulating Israel's national security concept, which is also very much linked to the United States national security concept. So it will be interesting to hear him also from a third party, Russian perspective. So this was Dr. Dima Adamsky, and we're also joined from Germany, our friend Dr. Josef Braml, German Council on Foreign Relations, the Transatlantic relationship he's going to talk about. And Josef Braml joined the German Council on Foreign Relations in October 2006 as editor-in-chief of the Yearbook International Politik. And he's also a resident fellow in the research program, USA Transatlantic Relations. So he's a very important authority on transatlantic relations and, of course, EU, Europe, and the United States. Prior to joining the German Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Braml was a research fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, the project leader of the Aspen Institute in Berlin, a visiting scholar at the German-American Center, a consultant at the World Bank, that's quite a heavy lifting, and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution, and also a congressional fellow of the American Political Science Association, and a member of the legislative staff in the US House of Representatives. So welcome here. And last but not least, Professor Arie Kacowicz from the Hebrew University. He's going to talk about the Latin American perceptions. Professor Arie Kacowicz is the Chaim Weizmann Chair in International Relations and Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations. His areas of interest include theories of international relations of Latin America, globalization, and global governance. His most recent book, Globalization and the Distribution of Wealth, the Latin American Experience, 1982 to 2008, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2013, only last year. So with this, and I don't want to belabor too much, I'm going to give you and start with Dr. Adamsky, the Russian perspective.
Ambassadors, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good evening, and I would also like to thank Professor Imbar and the organizers of this. Thank you. And the organizers of this conference for an opportunity to present. It's an honor and privilege to be here tonight. So I would like to share with you my thoughts on change and continuity of the US perception in the Russian eyes, the ways how US is seen from Kremlin during the last 2 decades. I think it's very important to understand the broader context of this perception in order to realize how it is seen right now. And this is the reason why I'm trying to offer a panoramic view. So I will briefly talk about 5 topics. I will talk about several stages in the way how US was perceived in Russia during the 20 years. I will specifically look and analyze threat perception of Russia with regards to the United States. I will briefly talk about anti-American sentiment, especially in public opinion, and I will offer some thoughts about the way ahead. To make sure that my presentation sounds to you authentic, I will also try to talk with the strong Eastern European accent. So, all right. So, what is actually the way how US is seen from Moscow? We're basically looking through 3 or maybe 4 stages in the way how the United States was perceived. In the beginning, it was an euphoria. If we look into the final years of the Soviet Union or immediate the post-collapse time, we're looking at fascination with the American way of life, American political, social, and economic models. The US was seen as an equal co-winner, if you wish, of the Cold War. However, this feeling started to evaporate somewhere in the mid-90s when adaptation and emulation of these models produced very strong frustration in Russia. In fact, emulation of political, social, or economic models produced chaos, instability, feeling of humiliation, especially in the international arena. More and more people in Russia started to see the collapse of the Soviet Union during their troubled times of the 90s as one of the biggest geopolitical catastrophes that happened to their country, and they blamed the United States for it. The international system started to look like as unjust. The US was seen as someone or as an actor that is exploiting a unipolar moment, that is using double standards in foreign policy, whose foreign policy is often hypocritical, and actually the only thing that preserved Russian sovereignty at this time was nuclear arsenal that happened to survive the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is the time when Russian attitude moved to the stage of competition and later on of the confrontation. It was a time when Russia was rising from its knees from the early 2000s, primarily thanks to exports of hydrocarbons and the rising price of those in the world market. And this is the time when Russia started to upgrade its international status, trying to turn itself into an indispensable actor of international relations, primarily through competing with the United States. Because if you are competing with the hegemon, if you are in the strategic competition with the hegemon, automatically it elevates your position and status in international arena. So we are looking at 20 years and right now also of some sort of zigzags between, or ideological pragmatic zigzags between competition and cooperation. Both can coexist, it's not mutually exclusive. And also we will look into some conspiracy theories that can result in the very counterintuitive or puzzling perception of the United States. So what actually are we looking into? What are the main sources of concern and irritation as far as the US policy is concerned when it comes to Russia? First of all, it's a security dimension. Despite the pledges that were made by the US administration to our country after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and NATO are expanding eastward. It's not only about the former Warsaw Pact countries, it's also about near abroad, the zone of privileged interests. The first wake-up call that we received was actually in the late 90s when the US unilaterally used force in Yugoslavia. And from that moment on, things are getting worse more and more. It's not only that US is pushing itself into our backyard and into our zone of privileged interest, it is also destroying or threatening our alliance architecture in the near abroad and also in the Middle East. It's not a globalization. We are not seeing this expansion of the US foreign policy as a manifestation of globalization, not at all. It's actually a clear anti-Russian move. And we see it right now in the Middle East. They are after Iraq, they're after Libya, they're after Syria, they are after Iran, our main allies in the region. To make things worse, they are also systematically trying to erode our nuclear deterrent, our only security guarantee. If you look into American arms controls initiatives of the last 10 years, we are viewing them as one integrated whole that is aimed to downgrade our nuclear potential. START treaty is in fact lowering the threshold or their arsenal, their numbers of the arsenal. It is squeezing, and Prompt Global Strike initiative in fact provides the United States with conventional decapitation and disarming capabilities against our nuclear arsenal. US withdrew from anti-ballistic missile treaty, so right now our second strike capability is significantly threatened. And to make things worse, the United States during the last couple of years is pushing us towards a treaty on tactical nuclear weapons. So eventually they want to leave us totally helpless and defenseless, especially in light of their conventional superiority in the Eastern Front. But it's not only about security. We are also under siege as far as energy is concerned. US is trying to penetrate regional energy markets and is trying to build a pipeline architecture that is outflanking and bypassing our interests. We can mention Nabucco, we can mention Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. So they are trying to deprive us from realizing our energy potential. And last but not the least, internally, under their flag or the title of democracy promotion or promoting democratic values, they are in fact intervening into our internal affairs. They are engaged in subversion and sabotage, and by supporting human rights organizations and NGOs, they are actually trying to explode our regime from inside. So, how specifically these trends that gathered momentum during the last 15 years are perceived right now? What is the view from Kremlin on the current administration? So if you wish to use the term of net assessment that people in Kremlin are doing right now, or if they are trying to examine the correlation of forces, the current correlation of forces, they are arriving to some sort of confusing or maybe even mutually exclusive conclusions. On the one hand, the US foreign policy is extremely dangerous. But on the other hand, the United States at the same time is very weak right now. The United States is still very dangerous because if we look into US foreign policy initiatives in Europe, as far as missile defense is concerned, in the Near Abroad, in the Middle East, it is just producing chaos and instability. And this is very dangerous for us. On the other hand, this particular administration is not consistent. It seems that it is confused. It is probably lacking strategic will for military engagement around the world. It is not really, it probably lacks our desire to dominate the escalation during particular crisis. And it is writing one failure after another. Just look what is happening in the Middle East. It's Iraq, it's Afghanistan, it's everything that happened during the Arab Spring, it's Syria, and it's Iran. It has an image of weakness, both at home and abroad. It demonstrated to us and to their own allies their low credibility as far as the alliances are concerned. Just have a look how they behaved towards Egypt, towards Georgia, and how they are behaving towards Ukraine right now. They are withdrawing from the Middle East, and probably, or highly likely, that they are entering the era of the new isolationism. By the way, we saw that each time when they spotted weakness, they exploited it. Exactly how they did in Iraq and in Libya. But when they saw an actor that is ready to push them back, they are deterred. And that's exactly what we saw in Syria and in Ukraine right now. And this is exactly what is going to drive our response and our policy towards the United States. So first of all, internally, we will try to restore the idea of Euro-Asian Union. At home, we will try to engage stronger in the battle of narratives and the battle of values, and to promote the idea that Western liberal values are not necessarily universal. That the Western approach is often hypocritical, and we will try to promote traditional values that are unique to Russia. And we hope that it will resonate and eventually produce coherence inside the country. Externally, we will continue flexing military muscles, whether it comes to the nuclear dimension or to subconventional hybrid warfare. And that's exactly what was done during the last crisis in Ukraine. On the energy side, we will continue to execute energy and economic pressure on European Union as a channel of influence on the United States. And of course, we will try to expand our global influence. We'll try to approach competitors of the United States and to counterbalance the United States, whether it comes to China or to other rising powers, maybe some actors that are qualified in the United States as a rogue state. We will try to demonstrate credible alliance responsibilities, and we will not leave our allies behind. It's exactly what we did right now in the Middle East. And of course, we'll try to cultivate new allies where the United States is leaving vacuum. Now, for a second, I am taking off the Russian hat and just offering you an observation on something that is taking place inside Russia, specifically when it comes to anti-American sentiment. I think right now we're looking into a very peculiar and interesting situation that is very different from the Cold War as far as the anti-American sentiment is concerned. My feeling is that anti-American sentiment right now in Russia is worse than during the Cold War. There's a growing social hostility that accompanies bilateral tension and their state-level propaganda. In other words, elite propaganda today resonates with more people than it did during the Cold War. There is a much broader anti-American sentiment, and people demonstrate not only antipathy, but resentment and even hatred towards the United States, unlike the Cold War, when, of course, the political propaganda, the elite propaganda existed, but covertly, a lot of people idealized the United States and the American way of life. And this is not what is happening right now. People tend to blame Americans for misfortunes at home and abroad. They're arguing that Americans exploited Russian weakness during their last 20 years. Americans are refusing to see us as equals on the political and on the social level. And right now, we're actually taking a revenge for the half-century of geopolitical and social humiliation. Many Russians today, if you're reading Russian press, or if you're just talking to regular people, stereotypically perceive Americans as superficial and blunt people that respect no one, that abuse their power across the globe, that bomb whomever they please, and recognize no other views and no other values than their own. Today, about 70% of Russian citizens consider the United States as their principal enemy. And this anti-American sentiment, in fact, is used by the government to construct a new identity, because Russia right now, as during the last 10 years, is in the process of reconstruction its national identity. So national identity right now is defined in many senses through opposition to the West. In short, in contrast to the Cold War, the anti-American sentiment is not only indoctrinated in the top-down manner, but it is brewing from the bottom up. If we look ahead, probably three main topics will preoccupy, or Russian decision makers will probably be, in the observable future, will be preoccupied with the three following topics. First of all, it's of course the US-led sanctions and subversion following the Ukrainian crisis. It's what is perceived in Russia, the US manipulation of energy prices and oil prices, because actually their low price of oil right now is attributed not to their forces of market, but actually to the efforts of the US administration. That's the way how many people in Russia see it. And of course, people are preoccupied with the potential consequences of the US policy in the Middle East. So I believe that in their next couple of years, Russia will produce its reaction to these challenges through migrating between on the two dimensions. One is constant migration between inclination to unipolarity or unilateral moves on the one hand and multipolarity. If you're reading President Putin's recent speech in Valdai or his recent statements after their occupation of Crimea, you will hear the motive of United States being blamed for turning international relations, contemporary international relations, for a total chaos where actors act unilaterally. So there are no rules of international relations anymore, and each of us is doing only what in its best interest, what serves its best. There are no rules for the United States, and there are no rules for us. This is one extreme, and we already observed several examples of those. But at the same time, there is another motive of trying to reestablish rules of international relations trying to restore and to take care of the particular episode after the Cold War when there was no Congress or no effort to reestablish or to rewrite the rules of international relations and to assure Russian role and position in international system. So probably we'll observe these two trends. On the one hand, some unilateral moves, and on the other hand, efforts to restore and to reestablish rules of international relations. And the second principle, or the second dimension, or the second migration that we are about to observe is a migration between confrontation and competition on the one hand and cooperation on the other. Although the US may be seen as a declining power and the power that is about to enter an era of isolationism, still in the observable future, it is seen as a hegemon. So there will be a place to confront and to compete with it, and this is why disjointing between the United States and European Union is something very likely in Russian policy, and also trying to split, to produce some kind of splitting in the European Union. And the tension about Ukraine is also likely to stay intact as balancing with China and with other actors. But at the same time, or even simultaneously, we are about to observe Russian participation, as we saw it right now, in some cooperative efforts, like Russian participation in P5+1, or maybe even some cooperation between the United States and Russia on the question of ISIS. So these two, on the first glance, mutually exclusive issues may coexist. I will probably stop here, and I will be happy to address your questions during the session. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Dima Adamsky. This was very, very important and in-depth analysis, and certainly you left with a taste for more that we will keep for the Q&A and the public participations, and we will go from here immediately to the European, the transatlantic perspective, Dr. Braml. Sorry, Josef Braml.
That's okay, Ambassador. They called me Joey in Gary Ackerman's office. Ambassador, thank you very much for this kind invitation. Professor Imar, thanks a lot for this invitation here. You have a wonderful team. I was in that business of conference organizing, and if I had done my job only half as good as your team as being that executing, my boss would have been very happy with me.
Very modest.
This organization really impressed me, and for me it's a challenge to speak here. I mean, speaking about modesty, I asked my wife, how can I ever say everything I know about US in 20 minutes? You know what my wife said, and that keeps me modest? Speak very slowly. So I tried to fill a few words.
You get 15 minutes now.
All right, Ambassador, you know your trade. Ambassadors always to the point, 50 minutes. I can't give you the German perspective or the European perspective, because there are probably as many as there are Germans right now. Because people are confused. People expected very much. I think too much. Obama, he was considered the political messiah. And it was difficult at that time, as somebody who has been watching American foreign policy and also the domestic determinants of US foreign policy, to tell my countrymen, guys, he won't be walking over water. There is gravity. There is a political system of checks and balances. There is Congress. So he may not be fulfilling every dream you have. And by the way, he's being elected by Americans, and he will be going after American interests. So don't expect too much, but that was difficult. Even Obama tried to do expectation management. I remember his victory speech, and he started with expectation management. He said, the problems are huge, probably too huge for one time for 4 years, so he was already campaigning again. But he was right, and I think we should consider that. So even realists should look into domestic determinants, not only of other states, but of their own country. And no matter whom you would have in there, he or she would have been forced with the same limitations and would have been forced to conduct a similar policy. I came up very early with a dim assessment. Wrote a book about the American patient. And I give you the thesis. People said, I mean, even for German standards, and we are quite pessimistic as a people. Americans are very optimistic, and as an American expert, you have to be optimistic yourself. So you always see, or you have to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but as a German, you always expect the train coming. But even as a German, I was too pessimistic for my countrymen. And a journalist asked me, how come you're so pessimistic? And I said, well, before I studied the facts, I was more optimistic. I would then read in the paper, expert Braml point, I lost every hope. Well, I didn't lose every hope, but I'm not that optimistic. And I give you a few facts, and my thesis I put in my book way back then, 4 years ago, which was this the inner problems, social, and this is not just a social problem, this is an economic problem in the US, if you have inequality. These social and economic problems weigh heavily on the political system, so it will block. I guess a few more people now know what I was talking about way back then, because we do have gridlock since 2012, when Obama lost the House to the Republicans. He had 2 years of honeymoon, did some good things. I think he did major accomplishments. Only history will judge him positively by that. But he is blocked since then. Every major initiative is mainly blocked. And you could put Superman into those structures. Well, the same people who have been expecting too much because they didn't know the institutional frameworks, the huge problems, now makes the same mistake and don't see this again. Now it has to be Obama, not their wrong judgment about the structures. Okay, if he isn't the Messiah, then he must be a bad guy. He doesn't fulfill all that. And historians jump on him. Yeah, maybe he's not assertive enough and he's not doing this and that. My friends, he has staff, he has experienced staff. This is not just about a man, this is about a structure. And this structure is in trouble since the last 20, 30 years. We have seen a culmination, and this financial crisis, which started in the US, had a history. And this financial and economic crisis is not over. We bought some time. The Federal Reserve bought some time by printing money. For many months, 85 billion a month. Think about that. And we still don't see economic growth. Guess what's happening now? We stopped quantitative easing. So don't expect the problems are over. So Obama was occupied with nation building at home. That's what he said. And we should realize that. So, second point of my thesis is inner weakness, social, economic, weigh on the political system, and the system will block. And that would be a problem for every country. But that's a bigger problem for the United States. That's a liberal hegemon. And I'm a transatlanticist. I think the hegemony of the US served us well, especially in Germany. A liberal hegemon was well advised after World War II to set up structures that, of course, America is in charge, but you want to make sure you define your national interest as broad as possible. So others wouldn't team up against you. You deliver free goodies, public goods, safety, free trade, stable financial system, and a stable currency. That's a liberal hegemon. So others would join your lead, don't team up against you. But that is history. We enjoyed it, but we still want to see that. We don't want to see that weakness, especially in Germany and especially in Europe, because if we saw that weakness, we would have to think on our own. Okay, if America is not providing security almost for free any longer, if we can't free ride any longer, then we must think about our own securities. God forbid. We start about this debate right now. If America is not really free trading and maybe even falling back into protectionism, what are you going to do? But that's an option. I see that coming. So forget about TTIP. Think about protectionism. And don't think the dollar will be the only game in town any longer. Some people even in the US think the dollar as a safe harbor is as safe as Pearl Harbor 41. I don't think we are at that moment. But we will see a change in the currency system. And that's, I would say, the most important point. We talk about military, maybe about trade, but we forget to talk about the dollar dominance, the exorbitant privilege, because, and that's my point, that's the most important tool of power for the United States of America, has been, and if America keeps its dominance, hopefully would stay so. Because if you have the world currency, the dollar dominance, you get the currency reserves of the world more or less for free. The Chinese give you money, the Japanese give you money, almost for free. No interest because you're a safe harbor. You can print money and they lose money. What can they do? They're in the dollar trap. They take out the money, they shoot themselves in the foot, in the knee, or even higher. And with that exorbitant privilege, you can do something. You can work, can do business. You can even organize an economic system where people don't earn that much over time. They lose money. Then they could use their houses, their credit cards, to compensate for these inequalities. So all that money from the rest of the world helped the American dream to stay alive. The housing bubble, which has been fed, especially by China, by Japan, and also by Europe, free money coming in, wrong allocations, fed a bubble, but that bubble turned around US economy. 3/4 of the US economy, that's 2/3 driven by demand, consumption, has been fed by the housing bubble. This bubble is over, this dream is over. Now we have to think about a different model. Who is going to pay now? China, South Korea, and Japan team up. They get out of the dollar trap. That's the biggest threat to America. America still there, Pax Americana. And they tell the Japanese and the South Koreans, guys, we protect you against China, but that has a price. The invisible hand of the market works slightly better with a slightly visible fist in the pocket. So you do trade deals. Oh, the Japanese are well advised to do trade deals with America that are excluding China. Trans-Pacific Partnership. South Korea is supposed to do the same, and so many others. Though I see not free trade at work, but geopolitics. You have a free trade initiative, and America is trying to, well, get something in return for a Pax Americana. Having trade deals that are against, well, China. And so, Japan, South Korea, many other nations have to decide. Security interests with America? But we heard it. South Korea has a lot more business with China. Currency cooperation, that's a game. Where does that leave Europe? Of course, we ourselves also oriented towards Asia. We have been pivoting there all along. Just about putting together our yearbook. China has been doing more business with Germany than America. Euro is a power factor, because the euro as well, not only the renminbi that is already regionalized, that is going to be internationalized, but also the euro is a threat to the dollar dominance. We already have 25% of the currency reserves, but the renminbi will be going on, and that's the game of the 21st century. Some people look at warships. I mean, Obama was right when Romney told him, yeah, you don't have this and that, and they can't steal this material and that material. And he said, Governor, we don't have that many horses as we used to have in the Civil War. But we still count horses as if we were still in the 20th century. Look at the power of currency, trade power. And maybe a final word. The business of America is business. So military is just a fist in the pocket, is just a side show of the invisible hand of the market. And Europe now has to really figure out where we place our interests. America is forcing us to take care of our own history. Not history, but security, maybe history. That's a Freudian. Ukraine, that's a European problem. From the US perspective, a realist, I think we're right, that's far away. US doesn't really have a vital interest in that fight. But we have to figure that out on our own. Though the US is finally forcing us to burden, share. I've been talking about that long ago. Remember Bob Gates, when he was leaving, telling the Europeans, guys, now it's serious. Well, we wouldn't listen. We talk about pooling and sharing and all those nice words. Now we have to put the money where our mouth is, as Americans would have it. Now it's time to show that we are capable of taking care of our own security. In terms of trade, not too optimistic. We will see this free trade initiative, TTIP. We have our own problems. But the bigger problem I see in the United States of America. This president will also be gridlocked, blocked, not only by his own party people, but Republicans won't help him. The atmosphere in Washington is really bad. I don't think he will be getting this trade promotion authority he would need to do trade deals. And by the way, they are not really interested in that European deal. The most important thing is this Asian deal that's directed against China. If they had been really interested in the European deal, then they could have asked just for trade promotion authority and done the easy thing first, the European stuff. But no, they want to do the Asian stuff first, and that's where we are collateral damage. So no trade deal, but expect more protectionism coming. Not from the administration, not from Obama, but look at Congress. So that's a dim view. Not that I wish America the best. I owe this country a lot. I learned to think in America. I had the best time of my life there. Therefore, it's hard now to look how this country has been changing, and it's also hard to talk with Americans about those things now. I remember days when Americans were much more easily engaging in problems, and that was the strength of America. Now, well, it's this open debate has somehow closed. But I hope we will see America that's strong again in the future, but I doubt that this will be anytime soon. But don't write America off. That will come back, but in the meantime, we have to do some thinking on our own. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Braml, or may I call you Joey? I also would like to share your sentiment. I also have spent some time in America. I had some very good time in America. Even my wife is American. So certainly we do not write off the United States. It's been very interesting to hear two polarizing views, very contrasting views. The European versus the Russian, where in the Russia we have long historic sentiments, political confrontation, some getting back for humiliations following the breakup of the Soviet Union. With Europe, it's more economic relationship, economic competitions, and certainly the, I would say, the broken up expectations. You mentioned, of course, how Obama was received as a messiah. Actually, we have to remember, Obama, and we cannot just, we are very actual and relevant in the diagnosing of the American status in the United States, and of course you cannot actually separate it from the president. And he started his campaign in Germany. And I remember how in the summer of 2009 or 8, he was welcomed maybe equally to Kennedy in '62, Ich bin a Berliner. So the hope was there, and then as big as the hope, so was the disappointment, and the disappointment came, as you mentioned. I was there at the Veraconda in Munich conference when Robert Gates, his parting words were, "We can no more shoulder all the NATO expenses, 75% on us, so get ready." Europe will be very interesting now after we heard from the Russian perspective and the European to hear Latin America, which is really the backyard of the United States, or they say it's the front yard. Yeah.
Okay, about 15 minutes. Okay, good evening. I want to start by thanking Professor Efraim Bar for bringing me from Jerusalem, and also to thank Liana for organizing this. You know that there are more chances that lecturers, university professors will meet in Washington or at ISA in the States that traveling back and forth from Jerusalem to Bar Ilan. There's also kind of funny remark in the title, in the program. It says Latin, not this is the updated title, but in the program you see Latin/American. It's not Latin/Americas, it's Latin American. And we are talking here about identities. Sometimes, you know, I'm an Israeli for the last 35 years, but as Dima, I will talk with an authentic Latin accent as well, coming from the bottom of the world, from Buenos Aires. And when people ask me, are you American? I say, of course I'm American. I'm American from the South, right? Because it's the Americas. So in a sense, that's part of the nutshell of what I want to talk. And a second remark, in a sense, I know that I'm in between you and the dinner, which is a problem, being the last speaker. We traveled since 2 p.m. We started at the US, and there was an interesting discussion between the US professors about who's Obama, or his IR paradigmatic affiliation. We were in China, we were in South Korea, India, Russia, Europe, Germany, Europe, and now you are with me with Latin America. What's interesting, what we don't have, right? We don't have Africa, we don't have the Middle East, we have tomorrow a lot about Israel, we don't have Japan, Australia, and Canada. It's something you can take, I mean, has nothing to do about Latin America in itself. And I really want to thank, Efraim, because in a sense you compel me to study something that I really don't deal with. I don't deal with US Latin American relations in general. I deal with international relations of Latin America among themselves. Okay, so I'll try to keep my comments for the next 30 minutes or so, and you can follow the outlines here. In a sense, the region, as you say, it's the backyard. It used to be the backyard. It's very misleading. The backyard is probably Central America and Mexico. It's not South America. And for the Israeli audience, you also have to learn, at least from this short lecture, the difference between Latin America and South America. Latin America starts from Mexico all the way to Tierra del Fuego. South America is from Colombia down. So it's a very relevant region for the US, right? In terms of oil, in terms of drugs. I mean, you can say both nice and less nice aspects of that. And the relationship between the Latin America and the US underwent many changes over time, right? So I can spend here the entire day talking about the history. One thing that it's very clear is that you have clear power inequalities and asymmetries between the parties. In a sense, the US, since the end of the 19th century, became the most powerful country in the Americas. And nowadays, it's still much more powerful than all the other countries together. Okay, with all my respect for Mexico, for Brazil, for Argentina, that's the case. So again, you can expect this lecture either as in Latin America I will start bashing Obama, or I will tell you how Latin Americans hate the US, which it's not necessarily the case. Probably from all the regions that we have been touring in this afternoon, this is probably the region where we have the great and long-standing grievances about Washington's actions and intervention, with very good reasons. If I were a Mexican, I'm not, I'm Argentine, so you will have very good reasons to hate the US. That's not necessarily the case. So what I want to show you in the next 10 minutes or so is that the picture is much more complicated than that. Okay, now, just a couple of minutes about history. We are talking about 200 years of common history, right? Since the last 200 years, since 1810 until today. The US, in a sense, fulfill a very important role in shaping the Latin American regional identity, the other. And that explains why Latin Americans have been always obsessed, concerned with the issue of sovereignty and non-intervention. They suffer from the Europeans, then they start suffering from the US, even before the Cold War, in the first half of the 20th century. And in a sense, the Latin Americans, many of them, they were shocked by the war that happened between the US and Spain by the end of the 19th century, where the US took Cuba and took Puerto Rico and took the Philippines. And in a sense, since then, you have these very uneasy relations where many Latin Americans look at the US as the patron, the benevolent patron, or the caudillo, but also with the mixture of hate and love, or as a model for imitation. So for instance, you see after the Spanish-American War, some Latin American intellectuals developed an ideology where they try to contrast themselves vis-a-vis the US. Now, during the Cold War, of course, this was exacerbated by an ideological animadversion between the two parties, and this lasted until 1989. And with the end of the Cold War, in a sense, the global arena moved towards complexity, and we hear that from other speakers today, where in the Western Hemisphere, until recently, you had a clear hegemony by the US. If the US is an hegemon somewhere, it's in the Western Hemisphere. Until today, maybe this might be changing. This might be changing in the last decade because you have the turn to the new left in the Americas, in Latin America, and also because of the Chinese presence, which is all over the place. In economic terms, China today might be much more important to Brazil than that's the case with the United States. So let me then turn to and I'll do something different from other speakers. I don't talk very much about the official positions of the political elites. And one of the things that I discovered, that there is a very interesting gap between the position of the political elites, that they tend to hate the US, and they say so, and sometimes they are very, I would say, they are not very coherent. They are even contradict themselves. The late Chavez was a champion of bashing the US, and at the same time he kept selling oil all his life to the US. So the question is, do Latin American citizens admire the US for its material wealth and the opportunities this creates for them? Or do they resent the US because of the long history of intervention, patronizing, and so on? Probably the answer is both answers are right. Both narratives are part of the perceptions that you have in Latin America. And when you look at the region, and again, that's a matter for another lecture that I should come and talk to you about that, is Latin America are 33 countries. So you have different, to talk about regional perception, because in a sense this panel is misleading. You talk about Russia, you talk about Germany, right? I have to talk about 33 countries, that's crazy. So you have different groups. You have one group which was the countries that are close to the US, whether Colombia, Mexico, Peru, ideologically speaking, I'm saying. Then you have the countries of ALBA, which is the group created by Cuba, Venezuela, with Bolivia, with Nicaragua, maybe Argentina, which is a crazy case always. And then you have the rest of the countries that they have a more ambiguous position. And what is interesting, again, at the level of the elites, the ALBA countries, they bash at globalization, they bash at the US, and they try to create an alternative approach. Pro-American attitudes, again, I don't have much time. I don't know how much time I have. I still have. I'm rushing. I know I'm rushing because I have an interesting quote. The liberal approach, the pro-American approach, you can hear that from Mario Vargas Llosa. Mario Vargas Llosa, you know, the famous Peruvian, he's very much a liberal in the good sense of the term. And I have here a quote from him where he says, and this is relevant to compare to other regions, another positive sign in today's Latin American scenario filled with uncertainty is that the old anti-American sentiment pervading the continent has diminished notably. The truth is that today anti-Americanism is stronger in countries such as Spain and France than in Mexico or Peru. There are two reasons for the change in attitude toward the United States, one pragmatic and the other one of principle. Latin Americans who have retained their common sense understand that for geographic, economic, and political reasons, fluid, robust trade relations with the US are indispensable for our development. In addition, US foreign policy, rather than back dictatorship as it did in the past, now consistently supports democracies and rejects authoritarian tendencies. So, whereas during the Cold War, you have this contradiction where the US always say that it supports democracy, at the same time it supports dictatorship. After the Cold War, you don't have that problem anymore. But what is interesting, when you look at the, and I think everybody here today have been using the Pew Research Global Attitude Project, where you poll the attitudes of the citizens. So you see that, and I will show you in the slide, you see in contemporary perceptions, and there you have several countries, that overall the attitude is favorable. To the question whether you have a favorable attitude or position, what do you think about the US? So you come with percentages over the 50%, with the exception of a country that I happen to know because I was born there, and I will tell you about that in a moment, which is Argentina is the outlier. But even Mexico had percentages 66% or 63%. That's very interesting. Even if you look at small countries like El Salvador, and there are other statistics of other countries, even Nicaragua, countries that suffer from the civil wars with US intervention, there you still have a very high support, a favorable position regarding the US. So, as I mentioned, if I draw very quickly along different country lines, so Mexico is the country that probably has the best reasons to detest the US. I mean, as you know, half of Mexico was taken by the US, and then the US also bought after that a little bit. You will write 5 minutes, that's more than enough. Okay, now as you know, and this is something that the late Huntington was very much concerned, not just with the clash of civilizations, what happened in the US is that the Mexicans have been doing the Reconquista, right? They have been reconquering by, in a sense, incorporating into the US culture. But in a sense, they are pro-Americans. Venezuela, that's an example, and here I have a quote of Chavez. You know, Chavez was an expert on rhetorics. So he said, in all history, there was never a government more terrorist than that of the US empire. He used the Star Wars analogy. He called the US an imperio, and Condoleezza Rice, those who know Spanish, he called her Condolencia Rice, okay? But overall, you see that gap between the leaders and the grassroots. Argentina in itself, it's probably the topic for a subject in itself, because historically speaking, they have a long tradition of animadversion. In a sense, Argentina is the first Gaullist, in the sense of de Gaulle and force de frappe, country in the world vis-a-vis United States. Argentines, they don't like the idea that the US didn't come to their rescue when the country had those economic crises. So very quickly, how do you explain the Latin American perceptions of the US states? As social scientists, you have to come with explanations. So there are three possibilities in a nutshell. You can say the perceptions are a function of the realities of asymmetrical distribution of power between the parties. Brazil is the most important country. Mexico, after that, Argentina is no longer in that list. I'm sorry. But the second, much more important argument, the realities of economic interdependence. In a sense, you'll find that countries and citizens that they have more contacts with the US, they will have a much better view of the United States. So it's a matter, somebody was saying, it's all, I think Ayalon was saying before, it's all the way economics, right? It's economics. And geography matters. You might find also a relation, although it's not perfect. Somebody said, well, Uruguay had a better view, but Uruguay is a much more civilized country than Argentina. In any case, is that the countries that are close to the US, they have a better view of the US than those that they are far away. So in conclusion, in a sense, what I try to show you is that we have to move beyond the stereotypes about US-Latin American relations. And it's much more complex than you expect. And the second point that I gathered that from a colleague that he should have been here. He's an expert on US foreign policy. That's Robert Lieber, right? And Bob, he's quoting, I discovered that he was quoting actually an Indian scholar. This is a wonderful phrase that encapsulate not just Latin America, but many views about the United States out there, reflecting what we have for this conference. And it goes like this. Yankee, go home, but take me with you. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we have now just heard these three presentations, and I want to thank you all, Dr. Adamsky, Braml, and Kacowicz, for very illuminating material, thought-provoking, and also dynamic delivery. Now the floor is yours, and I would welcome any questions or comments, and please be specific to any of the panelists here, and we'll start right there.
Can you raise your voice? I have hearing problems.
I think in the last half hour we've discussed the attitude of Russia, Latin America, whatever, towards the United States. That's not the truth. It's Obama. The American people, we have no ill will against Russia. You think the average American wakes up?
Don't look at me. Oh, if your looks could kill.
American wishes the Russian people ill will. I'll tell you what we are concerned about in America, and what we do hate is the opposing football team. I hate the Dallas Cowboys. I don't hate Russia. I wish you well. And this is about competition between the two, and making you look inferior, to have a complex. The smartest comment was made, go home, America, but take it with you. Still, America has been the place in the world where people can't wait to come in. And if there was any animosity towards America in the past, I think a lot of it has to do with the word jealousy. Because we were democratic, we elect our officials, we prospered, we had good health care, we had good education, and people wanted to come and be part of the American dream. And whenever there's jealousy, you're not going to ask you, what do you think of America? You're going to get a negative response. But don't confuse America with Obama. Obama's finished. We're going to have a Republican president, and the world will love America like they love Ronald Reagan.
So, okay, now a real question. Yes, thank you.
Can you identify yourself?
Mr. Adamsky and Braml, between the relation between Germany and Russia. Is that true that Ukraine is a lost case because Germany has so many interests with Russia and eventually Europe, that whatever happens in Ukraine, if the neutral win, Putin takes over?
Okay, I would start with you, Dr. Adamsky, and then Braml.
Well, I think it's more, well, thank you for your question. I think it's more for my German colleague, because from the Russian point of view, it's not the lost case. Excuse me? I think it's a very complicated issue, just because it was an unpreplanned issue. It was just an emerging problem that forced administration in Russia to react to some emerging of events. I don't think they have a pre-planned strategy for it. And right now, they are just trying at the same time to maximize benefits from this crisis, but at the same time to minimize the costs. So I think they show that they are pretty much, as my colleagues from the previous session already related to, demonstrated that this is the issue of significant concern, and they are ready to go far away. But right now, they're also looking for solutions to get out of this crisis, because as we are observing, sanctions and economic situation is something very sensitive, and although the current president in Russia, I would say, is more a historian today than an economist, because there was a period of time when he was primarily an economist, especially in his first term. Right now, he's more an historian and ideologist. But still, economy matters, he feels it, he actually can see what is happening at home, and this is why he's looking for solutions. Germany is a very natural place to look for the solution. But I will leave to my German colleague to relate to how to Chancellor Merkel sees it, because I'm quoting her, a couple of months ago, she said that President Putin probably lost touch with reality at some points. So it's still a very complicated issue. And going to your question, sir, about the attitude, this is exactly the insight that I was trying to highlight. First of all, just a disclaimer, I'm an Israeli. I'm not, I immigrated from Eastern Europe, but I'm just playing a role to generate this kind of reactions and questions from the audience. So at least this is a very interesting issue. Once people in Russia, especially during the Soviet times, they had some maybe negative sentiments towards the leadership, it was just part of bon ton to go along with the propaganda. But this is from 8 in the morning till 5 in the evening. But from 5 in the evening till 8 in the morning, these people were really sympathetic or idealized in many senses American people. This is something that started to evaporate during the last 10 years. A lot of people from Russia visited your country, they've been there, they experienced it, and right now they have a very strong anti-American sentiment, not only when it comes to the leadership of the United States, but just they disregard American culture, American people, American way of life. Although they do consider themselves more of Europeans than of Asians, but it's not about the United States. And there is a stronger anti-American sentiment going from the grassroots. So. I'm not. I'm just trying to show you that it's both. It's a fact of life. I'm not responsible for the Russians, but what I see is that we observe both the anti-Obama sentiment, but it's more on the level of political elites, and there's nothing surprising about it. What is really surprising that simultaneously you also see anti-American sentiment from the public. It has nothing to do with American policy per se. Thank you.
Maybe give you a little anecdote how I got in trouble in Moscow. I dare to say that America wouldn't consider Russia as the enemy number one any longer. The focus is slightly now vis-a-vis China, and they are that really hit a nerve there, because Russia needs an enemy. And vice versa, it feels good to be considered an enemy. And if you tell them they are not to be worthy as an enemy, then it's what you just said. And though we shouldn't underestimate the humiliation they feel for whatever reason. I mean, politics and also foreign policy is not always about rationality. And also in our Western capitals, we should think about strategies, for example. If the analysis is true, and here I speak as the editor of our yearbook, we look into autocracies, how to deal with autocratic states. So we look comparatively in different autocratic states, and we look how other Western countries deal with their bad guys. And last night I wrote the recommendations, looked at some patterns. And for Russia, it becomes clear that this is not a strong state. And here the realists may get it wrong again. They didn't really see that the Soviet Union would collapse because they wouldn't deem it worthy to look in the inside. Look at the inside of Russia. this is a very weak state. The economy is not really there. You had the protests 2012. Putin was shocked. Then Putin sees the Arab Spring. Then he sees something in the brother country, and folks panicked.
And for him, it's a chain of the events that are originating in one place, in State Department.
Putin's reaction is not, as realists would have it, a mistake by the West, because we got into the bears in a domestic or in the hood, not domestic, in the neighborhood. I think Putin's aggression is a sign of extreme weakness. And what Putin has been doing is compensate for economic legitimacy he couldn't provide. They have been talking about changing the way of doing business, trying to be not so dependent on oil and diversify and take care of corruption. Everything Medvedev and the liberal elites would lay out in front of us, Germans. They were quite clear, but years have passed, nothing has changed, he couldn't deliver. So there is no legitimacy there. Now what do you do when you can't provide output legitimization? You need opium for the masses. Well, religion doesn't really kick it off, but you have nationalism. And this nationalism is not self-confident, like US nationalism. Here are our values, come and join us, and you all come, you huddled, and liberty statute. But this is a nationalism that's not so self-assured. It's against others. It's against America, and it's against the West, Europe now. I've been there, the mood has changed. And now when we work with sanctions, we help Putin's case. Because then he can make the case, yeah, because of the bad West, we are now in trouble. It's not his mismanagement. He has now a scapegoat. That will help him. Look at his numbers, his poll numbers. Every other dictator would love to have those numbers that he wouldn't forge. He didn't have to forge those numbers. So it maintained the power. So sanctions, while we think, oh, they're wonderful, they may be symbolic and fine for our public consumptions, but they work in the other direction. And we have to be really careful, because the long-lasting effects will be there also by the low oil price. And here, to our American friends, I think realists will kick in again when they realize that Russia has now an Eastern option. We helped China to really close a deal with Gazprom. They wouldn't have been able to close without our help. Yes. They thank us. China is very thankful for a good price. Now it's not only oil, it's gas. And now think about what I just said before, and I finish. America wants to be the hegemon in the region, but China doesn't like that concept. So China probably wants to be in a position to also deliver goodies. China wants not to be blocked by America in the Strait of Hormuz, in the Middle East directly, not in Malacca, not everywhere else where America has drones. It has a few more options where America cannot cut off the lifeline of China. And one is land, Russia. So the realists may be waking up and realizing maybe we will need Russia one day to contain China. So think a few years ahead, and some realists already doing it, and maybe the whole thing in America, if I haven't told you yet, can be very pragmatic, sir.
Well, thank you, Professor Braml. One more thing, we all are reminded that one of the most senior advisors to Gazprom is no other than the former Chancellor of Germany, Schroeder, right? Gerhard Schroeder. So this is also factoring in, I'm sure. We have one or two more questions, but before that, I want to give the floor to Professor Arie Kacowicz.
No, just very quickly. China, is, by the way, is everywhere. China is now perhaps in Latin America being the new neo-colonial power, okay? China is buying Latin America as it's buying Africa elsewhere. But the comment to your comments is that was not a question. And this, I'm not here tomorrow, but I also saw a title, horrible legacy of Obama. I didn't like that title, I don't know. But I think that we should be aware of bashing Obama. I mean, I know that if you follow realist logic, right, the president of the US, you know, states are unitary actors, so you identify the US with Obama. But I think it's also a mistake, because there are lots of change, there are lots of continuities. If you ask me telegraphically, Latin Americans, they don't love or hate the US more because of Obama. They might be a bit disappointed. He promised to close Guantanamo in Cuba. He didn't do that. He loosened a bit embargo, not too much. Improved the relations with Brazil, not much of a change. But I think it's much deeper. When Latin Americans think or don't think about the US, or even here, it's not just Obama. It's too simplistic the way you put that. Don't personalize too much. Thanks.
Okay, we have one or two more. How many here are okay? Over there.
Arie, it's for you.
You have to shout. I have
I will
here.
shout.
Oh, good.
Don't shout.
You spoke a lot about how Latin Americans see America in Latin America. How do they look at America's global role? How do they look at America's involvement, the America-China thing? How do they look at the Iraq war? How do they look about America and Iran? Do they not look at it? Is it these questions we don't deal with? Are they questions that we look at and we just say, well, we don't like the big America in our region, so we don't like the big America anywhere? Or do they have a different approach?
Okay.
Okay, last comment by the lady here.
Please, I'd like to ask Dr. Adamsky, how do you conduct polls in totalitarian You say 70% are against the U.S., but they're all scared to death from Putin. The newspapers are not free. And so what happened to the 3 girls who dared saying something to Putin? They got 2 years in jail. How do you do that poll?
The Pussy Riots you're talking about. Yeah.
So, I mean, if you lived in such a country, you would be afraid to say anything. So, what has changed since communist time? And I know because I was there during communist time, and I was arrested during communist time, and I had a book of Hemingway with me, which they took as a anti-Soviet propaganda. So, I know what it is to be afraid of authorities. So, how can you conduct polls?
You writing your response now?
Oh, I will let to Professor Kacowicz.
Ah, okay, go ahead.
Okay, Jonathan, that's a wonderful question. And again, you know, that's another topic. And again, I can answer you Brazil, right? I mean, Latin America in general. What you can say in general, and I think you can find probably parallelism to Russia or to many other countries, is that they would like to see more of a multipolar order or multilateral rather than US hegemony, okay? So that will be the short answer. Now, what you will see, for instance, look at their vote regarding the invasion of Iraq 2003, they were split over, right? I mean, some of the small countries close to the US vote with the US, some abstain. Okay, so in a sense, the Latin American countries, they don't want the US to rule the world. Okay, and if I can add something that interests all of us, the fact that they vote for the Palestinian state a couple of years ago, they didn't see that in the sense of the zero-sum game that we see here, because they saw that as part of a larger context in the world, that they are supporting Palestinian state as they were supporting many of them, the partition plan in 47. So that's their attitude. They want to see a world which is more multipolar, more open, not just ruled for the US. But there is no much alternative militarily to the US.
Well, thank you very much. One conclusion, I think, from this panel. You want to say? Okay. You have.
Well, although I'm
1
used
minute.
to totalitarian traditions, but still I would like. I was socialized in Israel. also for
45
some time,
seconds.
yes. It's an excellent question, but the answer is very easy. First of all, specific poll that I was using, it's a Levada poll. So right now we can talk about it after the session, but Levada polls are doing, I think, the most objective or the most reliable right now polls that we can find. Now, in general, although it's an authoritarian state, but it's not a situation similar to the Soviet times. If you go to Levada polls of the last couple of years, you will see rather different responses in the public attitude towards the United States and also rather different attitude towards President Putin. Right now, he has an unprecedented support. If you will go to their polls 1 year ago, you will see unprecedented decline in his support. The fact that you mentioned the Pussy Riots that you mentioned that were put in jail, people who are part of Bolotnaya movement, the protest movement of 2012, several TV programs and several newspapers, in fact, demonstrate that there is rather significant opposition. There is, of course, a tendency to crack on this opposition right now, but still it exists. So unfortunately, and fortunately for scholars, we can still have a glimpse into the way how masses think in Russia today by using these polls. However, I think I do share your feeling that we have a closing window of opportunity to look into that. And since I'm also the product of the Soviet educational system, I read Hemingway at school, so I wasn't put into jail for reading Hemingway. So.
Well, this is the conclusion of this panel. I think it was quite fascinating. And one conclusion, if I may, from all quarters of the world, we see that the United States, more than any other country, is a point of reference. And as a result, it is still what I call, actually I quote Madeleine Albright, the United States is still the indispensable country in the world. And let's face it, yes, let's face it, there is no match to the United States, not Russia, not China, not even the European Union, and in every sphere. And I would say that the capability of the United States to continue and lead or make a very positive contribution for world stability, sustainable development, and peace, hopefully, ultimately, is not the quantifiable capabilities, but the political will. As long as the American people, and we are all mindful, of course, of the demographic changes over time, and as it is foreseeable in the next generation, as long as the American people will understand and believe that it is within their own vital interest to continue and make a difference in the world, I think then we are all hopeful for a better international arena. And one advice from somebody who stayed in the United States in different capacities, never bet against the United States. Thank you very much. And now that you have all worked up, hopefully, a healthy appetite, I guess we're going to dinner.